The town stirred slowly beneath a sky bruised with the first light of dawn. Dust clung to the streets like a thin, tired veil, and the wooden rooftops shivered under the gentle caress of sunlight. In the inn's kitchen, Clara June worked silently, her hands red and raw from the chill and the ceaseless chopping of vegetables. Steam curled from the pot like soft smoke from forgotten fire, and she hummed to herself, a quiet song that seemed to tether her to the world she barely belonged to. She was young, barely 23, but her shoulders bore the weight of years she had never truly lived. Whispers had followed her from town to town, a low hum of judgment she could never quite escape. "The cook will never be more than a cook," they said. "Nothing but a hand in the kitchen and a mouth to feed." Clara kept her eyes lowered, but the sting of their words lingered in the hollow of her chest, as persistent as the winter wind that clawed through the cracks of the inn's windows. He arrived on horseback, a solitary figure cutting through the dawn haze. Silas McGraw, mountain man, 48, and the kind of man whose reputation preceded him in every town he passed. Dust clung to his coat, and his boots left deep imprints in the dirt. His eyes, dark and steady, lingered on Clara, not with the crude appraisal she had learned to expect, but with a quiet attention, the kind that noticed the curve of her shoulders, the careful way she moved, the subtle grace she carried in her every gesture. It was a moment heavy with unspoken understanding. The town had long whispered of Silas' stoicism, of the silence he carried as if it were a mantle. But in that silence, Clara saw something different, a patient watchfulness that made her heart stumble, as though she had been missing it all her life without knowing. The inn's small dining hall bustled faintly, though few were awake at this early hour. The smell of stale coffee and burning wood mingled with the crisp chill outside. Harold Tilling, ever eager to trade gossip like currency, leaned lazily in the doorway. His eyes flicked to Clara with a subtle smirk, a judgment she had learned to meet with polite indifference. But this morning, even his whispers seemed muted, drowned beneath the undercurrent of something stronger and steadier, the presence of Silas McGraw. The events that followed were not of Clara's choosing. A town wager, crude by modern standards, placed her under the authority of Silas. She froze, heart pounding, cheeks hot with indignation and fear. Her life, so carefully contained within the small walls of the inn's kitchen, was suddenly uprooted. Yet even then, there was no harshness in his voice, no attempt to command her compliance. His gaze was a calm harbor, steady and unwavering, and though the act of being one filled her with unease, she could not find it in herself to resist the quiet dignity he carried. The journey to the mountain homestead stretched before them, the wilderness opening like a living painting. Snow-clad peaks rose like sentinels against the sky, streams whispered secrets through the forest, and the pine-scented air seemed to cleanse the tension that clung to Clara's chest. She observed Silas as he navigated the rugged terrain with practiced ease, each movement precise, each gesture thoughtful. He repaired a broken fence with patient hands, coaxed a frightened horse to trust again, and tended to the small fires that dotted their path with a care that spoke louder than any words could. Clara's resentment mingled uneasily with a growing awareness of his kindness. She worked alongside him in silence, feeling the heat of the fire and the faint pulse of life it carried. The roughness of his hands, the quiet authority in his movements, and the gentle attention to detail began to weave themselves into a tapestry of trust she had long thought impossible. The mountain did not rush, and neither did he, and in that measured pace, Clara felt the first flicker of something she could not yet name. Even as the wilderness opened its arms to them, the shadow of town gossip lingered in the corners of her mind. Letters arrived occasionally, carried by weary riders, the ink scrawled with expectation and judgment. They reminded her of the life she had left behind, of the constant scrutiny that had made her shrink in on herself. Yet, in Silas' company, those echoes of shame seemed distant, softened by the warmth of shared labor and unspoken understanding. In the evenings, she watched him from the doorway of the cabin, his silhouette framed against the dying embers of the fire. The world outside might have still been harsh and unforgiving, but here in the quiet mountain air, there was a sense of equilibrium. Clara felt it in the steady beat of her own heart, in the slow exhalation of worry that had become a near-constant companion. Snow began to fall softly one evening, dusting the peaks and trees in gentle white. Clara stood at the edge of the stream that wound its way through the valley, her reflection blurred by the ripples. Silas approached silently, setting a small loaf of bread beside her without a word. She turned to him, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, a bridge was built, not of declarations, but of recognition, patience, and a quiet, mutual respect. Time moved differently here, slowed by the weight of mountains and the measured rhythms of survival. Each day brought small revelations. The way his hand lingered over a tool before fixing it, the subtle care in how he prepared their meals, the calm patience that met her every question with a gentle nod or a silent understanding. Clara's heart, once heavy with shame and the weight of judgment, began to stretch, unfurling slowly like new leaves in spring. Though words were few between them, the language of gestures became rich and vivid. A shared glance, the offering of a mitten, the passing of a cup of tea, they all spoke volumes. Clara began to understand that trust, and perhaps love, was cultivated in these quiet exchanges. The mountain was harsh, yes, but it offered clarity, space, and a chance to rediscover herself away from the relentless gaze of townsfolk who would never understand her quiet worth. As the first section drew to a close, Clara lingered by the stream, letting the snow fall upon her shoulders, letting the water mirror her reflection back at her, fragmented and shifting. Silas stood a few steps behind, as always, steady and unwavering. There were no promises yet, no declarations, only the slow, patient building of something enduring. And in that patience, in that quiet intimacy born of gestures and shared labor, Clara felt a spark of hope stir, soft, fragile, yet impossibly alive. The town stirred slowly beneath the sky, bruised with across the first light of dawn. The cabin was quiet except for the hiss of the fire, tired soft breathing of Clara, and the wooden rooftop already awake, shivered under the hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. In the inn's kitchen, Silas moved around the cabin with the same deliberate care. Her hands red and raw from the chill, stacking firewood, ceaseless checking the horses, adjusting the curls from the pot along the tree line. Soft smoke. Every movement spoke of a life home, and she hummed to rhythm and necessity. A quiet song yet that seemed to tether her to the world she barely belonged to. Clara watched him, tracing the lines of his face, but her shoulders bore the weight of years, noting the way his calloused hands moved. Whispers had followed her from town to town. She felt the warmth of judgment, steadiness she could never quite escape. Easing the tension never be more than hadn't realized she carried. Nothing but a gentle hand in the kitchen settled between them. Feed. Not Clara kept her eyes but filled with the language, but the sting of their words lingered. Glances, gestures, small kindnesses that slowly as the winter wind clawed through the cracks of the inn's windows. The tranquility. He arrived on horseback. A sudden commotion figure shouting through the dawn haze. Harold Tilling, Silas McGraw, riding hard, mountain man from exertion, 48, appeared at the and the kind of man whose reputation behind him seated him. A few townsfolk followed. Eyes dust clung to his coat, voices carrying accusations that cut sharper than any blade. His eyes, Clara dark and steady, you're to return with lingered on Clara. Silas McGraw not with no the crude appraisal she had learned to expect. The words stung, but with a quiet bringing attention, back memories the kind that noticed him tonight, shoulders spent under the careful way she moved. Clara's heart pounded, subtle grace, but she did not falter. Carried in her every she felt Silas' presence. It was a moment heavy, a protective shadow. His gaze calm. The town had long whispered of Silas' stoicism. She drew the silence she hadn't known she possessed, as if it were a mantle. No words, but in that silence, his mere presence, saw something like an unmovable mountain, a patient watchfulness that made her heart. The townsfolk pressed closer, as though she had been missing it all her life, without trying to rattle her resolve. The inn's small Clara's hands bustled steady and strong from years of labor. Though few were awake at this early hour, and unclenched. The smell of stale coffee and burning voice mingled with the crisp chill outside. I'm not a prize, Harold. I choose where I go. Ever I choose to trade gossip. The word surprised leaned lazily, resonant and full of authority. His eyes flicked to Clara with a subtle smirk. Silas stepped beside her, learned to meet with polite indifference. He did not raise his voice. Even his whispers seemed muted, but the aura beneath the undercurrent of something stronger and steadier. The mountain had taught him the presence of Silas endurance. The events that followed were not of Clara's choosing. His eyes, a town wager and crude by modern standards, met each challenger and placed her under the authority of Silas. The crowd felt the weight of a force that could not be swayed by shouting, hot with indignation and fear. One by one, her life, they faltered, so carefully contained within the small walls of the inn's kitchen. Finally, was suddenly withdrew, uprooted, muttering, yet even leaving then, Clara and Silas, there was no harshness in his voice, triumphant, no attempt to command her compliance. The tension his broke gaze was a calm harbor. Clara, steady and unwavering, a laugh escaping, and though the act of being one filled her with unease, trembling, she could not find it in herself to resist the quiet dignity. She felt light. The journey to the mountain dignity reclaimed stretched her spirit invigorated. The wilderness opened. Silas allowed a small smile. Snow-clad peaks rose for the first time against the mountain man's streams whispered secrets through the revealing the depth of care. And the pine-scented air seemed to cleanse the tension that quiet routines once more. She observed between them as she navigated the rugged terrain. Clara no longer felt like a shadow in someone else's story. Each movement precise. She was present. Each gesture thoughtful. She repaired the kitchen with a calm, patient hands, and Silas, coaxed a frightened horse to trusted her decisions, and tended to the small fires that dotted their path, and continued to teach through example rather than command. Clara's connection mingled in subtle language with a growing awareness of his kindness. A brush of hands worked alongside him in silence, the offering of a blanket on a cold fire, and the shared laughter over a burnt meal. The roughness of his hands, the sun quiet authority in his movements, painting the sky, and a gentle attention to detail began to weave themselves into a tap together in the stable, cleaning the stalls and brushing the horses. The mountain did not gust of wind and rattled the cabin windows, and in that measured pace, the air held the scent. Clara felt the first flicker of something she could not both staring out at the wilderness, even as the wilderness letting the silence envelop them. The shadow of town gossip lingered in the corners to adjust a lock of Clara's hair that had fallen into her face, carried by weary riders. The gesture was gentle, the ink scrawled with expectation, but it carried a weight neither they reminded her of the life she had left behind. Clara's heart surged with something she had never dared to made her shrink trust on herself. Warmth, yet perhaps the Silas company. Those echoes of shame, and for the first time, distant. Their eyes softened by the warmth of shared labor, in truths unspoken, fully understood. In the evenings, it was not a declaration from the doorway of the cabin, but a recognition of shared framed against the dying embers of the fire. And the world outside might have still been harsh of affection, unforgiving. The following day, here in the quiet they received news of there was a sense of equilibrium. The mountain roads would be treacherous in the steady beat. The townsfolk would likely retreat in the slow exhalation of worry, leaving the wilderness quiet, near constant, unpopulated. Snow began to realize softly the depth of life they had built together. Dusting the peaks, isolated, yes, but safe. Clara stood at the edge of the stream. She understood that love through the valley always her reflection blurred by the ripples. Sometimes it crept in. Silas approached, like snow covering the mountains, setting a small loaf of bread beside transforming her everything beneath. She turned to him. Then came the climax that would test them. And in that moment, not with guns, a bridge was built, but with the not ultimate assertion of their autonomy, but of recognition, a delegation of townsfolk, quiet, led by Harold. Time moved differently here, insisting on by the weight of mountains. Their voices rang harsh against the towering pines. Each day brought accusations, revelations, and the way his hand lingered Clara over no longer before fixing it. She stepped with subtle care, shoulders square, meals, and with the authority of a woman who had met her every question, she said, with a gentle nod, "I am not yours to claim." Silent understanding. I belong to no one Clara's but myself. Once heavy with those who respect the weight of judgment, Silas began to stretch. He merely stood behind slowly like a steadfast sentinel. Every muscle relaxed yet ready. The language of gestures became rich and vivid. The effect was instantaneous. The offering, the townsfolk faltered. The passing of a cup of tea, they all spoke across their faces. Clara began to understand that trust, the snow-scented air, love, all seemed cultivated in these quiet exchanges. One by one, the mountain was backed away, leaving Clara and Silas alone, clarity, clearing space, victorious not with and a chance to rediscover herself away from the relentless gaze that of townsfolk. They returned to the cabin, understand the air crisp, the fire as the first warm, section drew to a close, stretched endlessly. Clara lingered by the Silas stream, finally spoke, letting the snow fall upon her shoulders, letting the water stronger than mirror her reflection back at her. She smiled, a soft, trembling Silas stood a few steps behind, the kind that comes from being seen fully for the first time. Steady, without another wavering. They moved
There were no
closer,
promises yet,
sharing a small,
no
deliberate gesture,
only the slow,
a brush of hands,
patient building
a shared
of something
warmth,
enduring,
a smile
and in
that
that
spoke
patience,
of mutual
in
acknowledgement,
that quiet
and
intimacy
newfound
born
love.
of gestures
In the days
and
that
shared
followed,
labor,
their life
Clara
settled
felt a
into
spark
a
of
rhythm
hope stir,
of quiet companionship,
soft, fragile,
and slow,
yet
deepening
impossibly
connection.
alive.
Clara thrived, her laughter echoing through the cabin, her confidence and dignity fully restored. Silas, once a solitary figure, found himself laughing more freely, his gestures softer, his presence more open. Together, they transformed the harsh mountain wilderness into a sanctuary, a space where love was nurtured in patience, respect, and the tender language of everyday life. And in the end, Clara would reflect on it all, the whispers of the town, the trials she had endured, and the slow-blooming trust that had saved her. Life, she realized, was often quiet and unassuming in its lessons. Courage was built in moments of stillness. Love grew in gestures rather than declarations, and dignity could be reclaimed piece by piece when one dared to stand in the truth of their own worth. She would tell the viewer, if they would listen, do not measure your value by the noise of the world. Sometimes the smallest acts, the hands that feed, the eyes that watch over you, the silence that honors you, carry more love than 1,000 words. Stand steady, trust the slow unfolding, and allow yourself to be known. The snow fell softly outside, covering the mountains in a blanket of quiet light. Within the cabin, warmth lingered, and a slow-burning flame of trust, hope, and love endured, an enduring testament to the quiet power of grace, resilience, and the human heart.